Chairman, and I must start with an admission. I think I know a fair bit about the economic debate on the European Union. I think I certainly know a great deal about the issue of democracy and whether it can exist in the European Union as currently constituted. I do not claim to be an expert on the voluntary sector, and I am prepared to guarantee that every individual in the audience knows more about the voluntary sector than I do. But let me just recall an experience I had actually many years ago. I've been in the European Parliament for 17 years. I think it must have been at least 10 years ago when we had a big group of voluntary organisations come and visit us, and their concern at the time was some European labelling legislation which applied to electrical products. The original legislation was going to apply to electrical products sold in normal shops. But of course, it included, nobody had really thought about it, but it included the charity shops. And of course, they had a great problem with labelling, because if they had a second-hand toaster, they didn't know what the provenance of it was, and therefore it was extremely difficult. So a whole category of goods, which were good business for charity shops, were ruled out. And I remember the lady who was leading the delegation saying to me at the time, she said, "Our concern is that we are going to be killed by accident." In other words, the European Union is going to make rules that simply, without any intention, have a negative effect on that major and important area of fundraising. And I recount that story simply because I think it's about all I know about the voluntary sector, but I was very struck by it at the time. More generally, you have heard all the stories from the Remain side about the enormous economic damage which Brexit is going to do. And I have to say to you that many of the organisations that are saying these things, like the OECD, for example, are funded by the European, part funded by the European Union. If you look at the IMF, you have Christine Lagarde, who is a former French agriculture minister, and I suspect is very keen to keep British taxpayers' money floating through to French farmers. And you also have this sort of groupthink where large organisations tend to support the position of other large organisations. If I had more time, and you can't do it in 3 minutes, I would like to talk through why we on the Brexit side believe that far from costing us and far from creating a crisis or a recession, Brexit will in fact enable us to, first of all, throw off regulation which is holding back British business. Not all regulation, we recognise the need for regulation, but there is so much over-regulation that is damaging our economy. Secondly, to make trade deals with countries where the European Union has not bothered to make trade deals. So we're looking outwards to increasing trade. We're not talking about isolation and putting up the drawbridge, we're talking about re-engaging with the world economy. We believe these things will be very positive for the British economy, very positive for jobs, and where there is more money about, there is more money obviously for all the things we want to do in this country, including supporting charities, charitable work and voluntary organisations. There is a bright future for Britain outside the European Union, and I'd like the voluntary sector to be part of that.
Just the one.
Later on as well, I'll open it to the audience if people want to make points and ask questions. Liz, thank you.
First, is this working?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. First of all, a massive thanks to Val for organising this event. I think this will raise a number of issues which haven't had anywhere near enough publicity in the national media, so thank you. The question is, what's the single biggest reason for the voluntary and community sector for, and I would argue, for remaining in the European Union? For me, it is about protecting the social rights that I, as a proud member of the Labour Party, hold dear, but it is also about not putting at risk the jobs and public services which depend on us having a strong economy. You know, you've heard Roger say that it's a sort of groupthink of big national organisations. Well, I actually think when you have everybody from the Confederation of British Industry to the TUC saying there will be a huge hit to our economy if we leave, and that will put jobs, wages, incomes, and the money that we spend on our public services at risk, I want to listen to that. You know, the leaders of Unison, Unite and the GMB, alongside the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And in my own constituency, every company from BillSave UK, which is an energy efficiency company, to Rockwell Computer Company, saying to me, they don't want us to pull out because they fear it will put the jobs in their businesses at risk in future. And, you know, some people on the Leave side, or at least are honest, like Aaron Banks, who says, yeah, our economy would take a hit, but it's a price worth paying. But I say to you all here today, who will pay that price? Not Aaron Banks. I have to say, not Boris Johnson or Roger. It'll be the people who always pay the price when our economy takes a nosedive. The poor, the vulnerable and the low paid. Now I will have disagreements with Nicky on what's happening in our economy and the investment in public services, but we agree that putting our economy at future risk will mean less money into the public services and voluntary community services that we all rely on and which bind our families and communities together. The EU has put in place vital rights at work and protections for people with disabilities, for people of all different genders, of age, religion and sexual orientation. They are an important backstop protecting vulnerable people, whichever government is in power nationally. And let me just finish with this point. I joined the Labour Party because I believe that it is through the strength of our common endeavour that we achieve more than we do alone. I was brought up with a family that was deeply engaged in the community and with the voluntary sector. They taught me that our family would do better when our area did better, and we should never leave anybody behind. I believe those principles underpin the European Union. It's not perfect, but when something isn't right, you work to fix it. You don't quit and pull out. Going it alone will not work. Join us in this fight to protect our communities, our economy, and build a better, brighter future. Thank you.
Not so bad, the first two speakers in keep to 3 minutes, slightly wandering over, but as I stand up, I will stand up with 15 seconds to go.
All right.
You would have to do more than that.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I've been told now.
Sorry.
That's okay. We've been asked to name one benefit for our side, and I would say the one benefit that stands out for me in the voluntary sector is localism. Because looking at the voluntary sector, of course, the very nature of the voluntary sector, the very nature of volunteering and community-based support is that an individual wants to improve their community, so they initiate plans and collaborate with others in their community to set in place action plans and actual steps to address a certain issue. This, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, is very unlike the European Union, which is a large, top-down rather than bottom-up set of institutions which the UK spends billions, tens of billions of pounds on each year, and has a sprawling bureaucracy that makes legislation, makes regulation in the interests of others. Not indeed local communities, when you're talking about fishing communities, when you're talking about communities around steelworks and what have you, when you're talking about agrarian communities, farming communities. These decisions are being made on a top-down basis from people elected, or indeed some cases not elected, in Brussels and in Strasbourg. So the very nature of the European Union is very different than what I would say, characterise as voluntary initiatives, community-based support schemes. And indeed, talking about spending plans, you have, in the course of the last Parliament, more spent on EU membership as a net element of our contribution than all the austerity plans put together. In fact, if those were to be compared, we spent £42 billion from 2010 to 2015 net after rebate, and 38 billion in terms of austerity. Meaning, in effect, that if we left the European Union, there may not have been necessary, those austerity plans, and indeed we would have 4 billion left over to play with as taxpayers. The point, I would say, again, is the main benefit is localism, making your politicians more accountable and more responsive to local communities, not just here in Leicester, but elsewhere in and around the United Kingdom. And it does show who supports the Remain side, as an element of why this is that local communities are being sidelined, because Goldman Sachs and other investment banks do not have at their heart the welfare of local communities. They love Brussels because it gives them the centralised plan for lobbying and control, unaccountable for a racket that we don't have direct influence over. Ladies and gentlemen, a vote to leave on June 23rd will be a vote to take back control and allow local politicians to be able to be more responsive to community needs, and as a result we would be better off out. Thank you very much.
Rory?
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today, for giving up your Friday lunchtime to hear about the EU referendum debate. It's very nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. For 3 weeks today, I suspect by now we will know what the result of the EU referendum is. This is a momentous decision to be made for this country, for our future, and not just for our future, but for future generations as well. And I think that we can talk about the money and the numbers and everything else. But I think actually what the vote says is what kind of future we envisage for this country, what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to turn our backs on the rest of the world, at the same time as continuing our membership of organisations like the UN and NATO? Or actually are we an outward-facing nation, and nowhere more so than a city like Leicester and a county like Leicestershire, where we have welcomed in thousands, tens of thousands of people over many generations who have made this part of the country, and I would argue the country as a whole, much richer and stronger, and we have benefited from everything that people have brought to these shores. Now, we are not an isolationist country. Now, the question that we've been asked as a panel to address in our first opening statements is what one benefit, and I do agree with Liz, she's right. She and I disagree about many things, but we also work together well, I have to say, as city and county members of parliament when it's right to do that for this, for our constituencies and for the local area. But there would be an economic shock. We can already see business investment and just decisions about things like how many employees to take on when university graduates reach the jobs market in September. But we can see that investment is slowing down, and I would argue that would have a direct impact on the fundraising and the financial support for the voluntary community sector and social enterprises in this area. When I was elected in 2010 at the same election as Liz, I think one of the first conversations I probably had with Kevin and others, John Storer House in my constituency, social enterprises and charities locally, was just how tough the financial arena was for them. Now look, we can argue about what's happened over the last 6 years and spending decisions and everything else, but frankly, this thing about Rory's, this £4 billion to sort of play with, because we wouldn't be spending 42 billion and everything else, it's just fantasy economics, and they are peddling rubbish to people in this country. You know, Roger Helmer talks about these institutions being part funded by the EU. Well, UKIP is part funded by the EU, and they managed to have an independent thought on what the future holds. So I would argue that those other organisations could do as well. And to say that we wouldn't need to spend money on things like laws and anti-discrimination and looking at important things that protect the voluntary community and social enterprise sector in this country and people in this country is, again, absolute drivel. So I look forward to this debate, but for me, the big thing about Remain is not just about stability, it's about moving forward, not refighting the battles of the last 6 years, but moving to continue to support the great work that all of you do. Thank you.
That was a good trick, Nicky, so you didn't look at me when I said that.
It's not caught my eye.
Steve.
Okay, thanks. Speaking on behalf of the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, I don't feel I'm speaking on the side of anybody on this platform, actually. I stand for leaving, but for totally different reasons to everybody else. And my point of view is a point of view of many trade unionists and socialists and people in the country that is not heard in the media or anywhere else. I actually think that as is stated in some of your own material, one of the main aims of the voluntary sector is to deliver services to the most vulnerable. And if you want to pick one reason why I want to leave the EU, is because far from protecting the most vulnerable, the European Union actually harms them. And in the short time I've got, I'll try and demonstrate it. I'm actually a socialist, and I'm an internationalist. And I stand alongside the French workers who are at the moment taking strike action and protesting against the attacks on their rights that are being imposed by the government, ironically called a socialist government in France. It's not socialist in any way, shape or form, which is imposing new labour laws that attack working hours, holidays, terms and conditions and so on, job security of working people in France. The socialist government, again in inverted commas, in France is responding to criticisms of French labour law made by the European Union. And the European Union Commissioner for something called the Euro and Social Dialogue, rather bizarrely, has welcomed and praised the government for trying to impose that. So why does the European Union support those laws and support that action by the government? Because the European Union is a neoliberal boss's club. Its treaties, the directives, the institutions, the legal setup, are fundamentally the most important thing to them is actually maximising what they call competition, and which is really profitability for big corporations across Europe. And actually workers' rights, public services and welfare all stand in the way of that profitability. The same is happening in Belgium, where workers there are protesting and have a general strike planned against attacks on their working hours, their holidays and so on. I stand with the Greek workers and the Greek people who've suffered a 1/3 cut in their living standards because of, oh, is that how far out of time I've got? Oh my God.
You'll get another chance to speak later.
Yeah, it's because they, yeah, I'll carry on later. They suffered the austerity that's been imposed at the behest of the European Union. In Ireland, they fought water charges, their equivalent of the poll tax, and the European Union is now saying the government can't scrap them. So I haven't got time to go into the rest of it. But this will impact on Britain if, for example, we end up with a government saying it's opposed to austerity and opposed to cuts and defends public services. It will come into conflict with the EU. I'll try and explain that more later.
Okay, after our final speaker, what I will do is I'll open it up to the floor. So I'll take 2 or 3 or 4 contributions from the floor and try and balance those as well from different sides. Please, when I ask for that, I will not accept people making speeches from the floor. We have enough people making speeches here. So please make comments briefly if you're invited to do so. So for that, Dave.
Thank you. First of all, will you excuse me remaining seated? Thanks to the National Health Service, a broken leg has been mended, but I've still got some after effects from that. I did it very thoroughly indeed and had to have a transplant and skin grafts and whatever. So I will remain seated. It's very easy to give one reason why it's beneficial for the voluntary and community sector to remain in the EU. Because the EU is underpinned by a commitment to equality, fairness, solidarity and social justice, the values which are the same as those of the voluntary and community sector. And where does that come from? Let us not forget that the EU grew out of a determination not to repeat the mistakes that were made after the First World War. In the 1920s and 1930s, we saw the dismantling of German industry. We saw reparations having to be paid to the countries that had won. We saw a constitution developing that encouraged demagogues like Hitler to say, I will take you out of this problem. And he told lie after lie after lie, blaming the Jews and saying, once I'm in power, we'll sort those problems out. Not only that, we saw the rise of communism and the power of Russia unchallenged. So during that time, there were bright people who saw we can't allow this to happen again. And Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, with the help of the Marshall Plan, said, we will get the countries of Europe working together. We will coordinate the production of coal and steel. We will start the industries going again. We will cooperate. We'll get rid of barriers to trade within the EU so that industries can prosper. We will support the social aspects of life. We will make sure that people don't have to work excessive hours. We will ensure that there is support for maternity leave. And a whole series of ambitions have slowly been fulfilled. And Europe is prosperous, it's peaceful, and we have a queue of people, countries, wanting to join. But we don't let them join until they meet our standards. Turkey's not going to join until it's prepared to stop imprisoning its journalists, until it's prepared to have fair and free elections. The other countries that have joined have had to sign up to all 35 chapters of civilised democratic behaviour. Europe has been a tremendous power for good, and it's working in the same direction as the voluntary and community sector. Not only that, it's supporting it in all sorts of ways, by solidarity, by encouraging people from the voluntary community sector to come. And there's one last point. I just want to get in the last 15 seconds. One of the things that I'm sure you've all read is the EU Referendum, a discussion paper for charities written championing voluntary action. It's only just out, it's terrific, it covers all the issues. In fact, you all read that, but you go home now.
As chair of the Leicester LGBT Centre, I don't actually, well, I guess I do in a sense want to just briefly talk about LGBT issues, but more widely about advocacy. From that document that you just mentioned, David, it says the European Commission values voluntary organisations' advocacy role, rightly recognising they have a legitimate contribution to make to policy debates. I'd ask those who are advocating Brexit if they really want to leave the charity and voluntary sector solely to domestic governments, when as recently, and I have to say this to Nicky Morgan, as just a couple of years ago, the then charity minister said charities should stop advocating for those we represent and focus on doing the knitting, and that was a direct quote. Are you really suggesting that we leave the charity and voluntary sector solely to the whims of domestic politicians and governments?
Nicky, would you like to respond?
Well, I'm not. It was to correct.
I know, but look, I'm starting.
Look. I mean, I think obviously, Matthew, that things have moved on. We've got different ministers and everything else now. But I think your broader point is right, which is, and I think we're going to come on, perhaps discuss it in the second of your questions, which is about the wider legal framework, but also the underpinnings of the EU, which I think are very important, particularly given my women and equalities roles, and which we gain by being part of something much larger. But I think your question is better directed to Rory and Steve and Roger.
Roger then.
Yeah, well indeed. Thank you for your question and your particular reference to LGBT rights, because what people don't seem to realise is that we in Britain actually had better legislation on those rights and better legislation on maternity leave.
You've not been the best champion of LGBT rights. You've not been the best champion.
Well, let him speak. Please let me answer. We have better protection and better legislation under British law than we have under European law, and there are several European countries that have quite negative policies in those areas. So this idea that we depend upon Europe to create our laws, actually we're capable of making them here. In some cases we have handed over the right to make laws. My particular bugbear is the constant harping on by the Remain side about clean beaches. Well, of course our beaches are cleaner now than they were 40 years ago, but if you go to other countries that are not in the EU, their beaches are cleaner too. Independent nations are capable of making their own laws, and if you are saying you do not trust British governments to make the right laws, what you're saying is you don't believe in democracy and you don't believe in the British people. I believe the British people can make
government. That's what I wouldn't trust.
Well, okay, fine, but that's not the issue today, if you don't mind.
Thank God.
Okay. Any other comments from floor, please? Careful, I could sell you something. Okay.
Look, it's true that British governments can make their own laws on anti-discrimination and so on, and I'm very proud of the Labour Party's record in that regard. Certainly I remember back in our first Employment Relations Act, which extended maternity leave and other issues, and when we put in the 2010 Equality Act, some of the people on Nicky's side who are, now for Brexit voted against those laws. And my point here is, it's not that we can't put those laws into place ourselves. But what Europe does is provide a protection of what I believe are basic fundamental human rights, as well as social rights, whichever government is in power nationally. And whilst I don't know whether, and I personally hope there isn't any likelihood of UKIP gaining a foothold in government, just think about the people who are calling for Brexit have fought it. I mean, Boris Johnson said scrap the social chapter. We've got UKIP has been against many of these laws. I want to see some basic human rights and rights at work that are protected whichever government is in power. No one is denying that we have the ability to make those laws in this country. But when we've done that, we've often done it, in the face of huge opposition. I think it's good that Europe protects those laws, and I want to see those remain.
Obviously, the question was for Brexiters, and I'm one of them, and I'm very sympathetic to the point that Matthew made, because I don't trust this government on rights. They are, for example, already attacking trade union rights with the trade union bill that's gone through. Actually, my point is the European Union has not necessarily defended people's rights when they've been attacked. This government has cut benefits. I'm affected by the bedroom tax personally. They've attacked trade union rights, and the European Union has not come running to their defence. The rights that exist in the social chapter weren't handed down by trade union, by European Union officials or bureaucrats. They were rights that have been fought for by trade unionists, by community campaigners, by organised groups over many, many years. When you talk about women's equality, I don't know if anybody's seen the film Made in Dagenham, but the Equal Rights Act in Britain in, I think, 1967, I can be corrected if I'm wrong, was a result of action taken by women machinists in Fords, and then backed up by other actions by groups of workers that pushed that through. That's the same with many other rights. So I don't think we should trust this government at all, but neither do I think we can trust the European Union to defend us. We can only trust ourselves in doing that.
So elect a different government.
Well, exactly. But we can do, hopefully.
Okay. Through that question discussion, we are actually have moved on to some of the ground around question 2, which is the EU's created laws that underpin our society and working lives, such as tackling disability discrimination, fair dismissal, and maximum working hours. They also hold governments and employers to account when these are undermined. So the question is, would leaving the EU diminish these laws, and who would hold them to account when they are in breach of people's human rights? So it's broadening on from where we started, but Liz certainly mentioned things like the social chapter, and Steve has broadened it as well. So David.
I was going to talk about something else, but I can come in on that, and that is that the European Charter of Human Rights was established very largely by the British as a way of guiding Europe forward after 5-6 years in which human rights had been completely tramped on by the Nazis. And that is something which is fundamental to it covers not only the European Union but the wider Europe as well, and it's fundamental to the background to the European Union. And no country that doesn't want to support the European Charter of Human Rights can be a member of the European Union. And I think 1 or 2 cabinet ministers need to bone up on that by saying let's dump the European Charter on Human Rights and remain in the European Union. You can't. The European Union is a factor for good, looking after people's rights, and it's very important. And a result of pressure from many of the countries in Europe, we now have the Equality Act of 2010, and I'm sure everybody here looks at that and says, yes, that's right, that's what we're all working for in the voluntary community sector. We have made progress because of that. Let me give you one little example. There was a lot of campaigning to get Abu Qatada back to Palestine, back to Jordan, because of things they said he had done. The European Court of Human Rights said you can't do that because in Jordan they still use torture. After a lot of pressure from the British government, quite rightly, the Jordanian government said, OK, we won't torture him. He went back, he was tried, and he was acquitted. Now that is the sort of progress for individual freedom and liberty which is really good, and it wouldn't have happened without that pressure from the European Convention on Human Rights.
Okay. Rory, do you want to come in, or just Roger?
Well, I would echo what Steve and Roger had said earlier about, firstly, democracy, being able to approve your own laws by the people, and secondly, what Steve said about equal pay and maternity rights and even collective bargaining having been instituted within the UK even before we joined the European Union, even before we joined the European Economic Community. So it's not as if the United Kingdom can't make these workers' rights. It is not as if we can't ensure freedoms of the individual. And I would like to say just one other thing, that broadly it's not just about workers' rights, it's about human rights. And the UK, from Magna Carta onwards, has been a champion of those. Indeed, collective bargaining was instituted through our common law system, not through the Napoleonic Code of the European Union. And indeed, there are EU countries still today that do not respect the rights over jury trials and habeas corpus and other things that we take as read. So it's not just workers' rights, it's general rights that actually the United Kingdom is way in advance of. I mean, habeas corpus has been around for at least 600 years within the United Kingdom. And yet, people around the European Union do not enjoy similar rights. And as a result of things like the European arrest warrant, individuals in the United Kingdom can be surrendered to these countries and face the consequences.
Thanks. Look, nobody has ever claimed that the push for equal pay didn't come from ordinary working women in this country through their trade unions, and then I'm very proud to say implemented by a Labour woman cabinet minister. So we can push for those rights from the grassroots up in this country, make laws in this land, and then push for those laws to happen more broadly. But sometimes Europe does things too. The 2000 Employment Equality Directive established a general framework for equal treatment at work that protected everyone from discrimination based on age, disability, sexual orientation and religion and belief. That was then implemented in the UK through the 2010 Equality Act. It's a two-way street. But what I believe in is that there are some fundamental rights, human rights, but also rights at work that we want protected whichever government is in power. And that's why I support those rights that the European Union protects.
Yeah, David said that the ministers ought perhaps to bone up on European human rights. I suggest that David should bone up on human rights legislation. He kept speaking of the European Charter of Human Rights. There is no such thing. There is the European Convention on Human Rights, and there is the European Charter of Fundamental Rights.
A minor terminological inexactitude.
A minor terminological inexactitude. But one point that I would make that I think is important here, we have in this country, we have had our common law, which as Rory said, has achieved great things over time. The danger is if you start codifying these things, what you end up with is judges making laws, because they will over-interpret those laws, and you end up with absurd things like I can't remember the detail of the individual, but it was quite a big story at the time. There was a foreign national here who had had several children by several different women, but managed to stay in this country on the grounds of his family right to a family life, despite the fact that he never supported any of the children. There was the other case where somebody managed to stay here because they managed to claim that their cat entitled them to family rights. This is over-interpretation of laws, and the moment you have these codified systems, you're inviting lawyers to have a field day and to come up with really rather silly solutions, and that's what we've seen over and over again.
Does anyone from the audience want to come in and make a comment this way?
I believe it's my right to be told the truth by politicians. Could I just remind you why we're here? how can anything based upon deceit be worthwhile? I was actually in the Commons the night we went in and listened to what was going on. I couldn't at the time prove that we were being told lies, but the proof is there now. The vote that night was so close. 8 votes took us in to what was called the common market. And how were those 8 votes obtained? They were obtained by withholding from the MPs the terms of entry. They did not know. Also, a very important legal report, which was actually drafted by the Lord Chancellor at the time, Lord Helmer, which threatened, warned about the dangers to our constitution and our sovereignty, was deliberately suppressed and was held secret for 30 years, now available. So that is my question now. How can anything based upon deceit be really worthwhile? I would just mention, I'm very saddened about the Labour Party. My father, was wholeheartedly a socialist. This is where I was brought up. 3 men actually got their seats in Parliament for the very first time, based upon the promise to take us out of the European Union, or what it was at that time, because it was bad for trade and jobs. Who were those 3 men? Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Jeremy Corbyn. I return to the question. I expect my right to be told the truth. How can anything based upon deceit and manipulation be in the end a good thing?
So, shall I ask the panel, is this campaign based on truth? Or is it all different people scaremongering from their own point of view? That's the question I'm asking. Steve?
Yeah, I want to come back on that, but also on the other points that we raised about rights. Firstly, I think there's a lot of scaremongering in this campaign. If you believe one side or the other, the world is going to end. Basically, there's going to be world war. There's going to be economic crisis. By the way, economic crisis, our biggest recent economic crisis happened in 2007, 2008, as a result of the banking collapse, while we're in the EU. You know, at the moment, manufacturing is now technically in recession while we're in the EU. It's actually the economic system that causes that crisis, not whether we're in or out of the EU. Anyway, that's a small point. On the issue of rights, what rights exist, for example, the European Social Chapter, this government can opt out of the bits it thinks it can get away with opting out of. For example, parts of the Working Time Directive, it's opted out of. Actually, when it first came in, I think it was the John Major Tory government opted out of the whole social chapter. It was reinstated by the next Labour government, is my understanding. So the European Union isn't a defence, it's what we do, it's how we organise to defend rights that's important. And I think one of the problems in this debate has been that the debate's been drowned out by voices representing one side of big business, the elite, the rich, versus another side of the big business, the elite and the rich. And there's no voice that represents ordinary people. And I think, you know, I'm for out, but I'm for a different kind of Europe. One where we do bring people together, a socialist Europe that fights for working class people, not for any of the options provided by other people.
I'm not going to be quick. Frances O'Grady, head of the TUC, represents 5.8 million working people. She's not part of an elite. Neither are the bosses of Unison, Unite or GMB. The guy who runs Rockhall, the company I told you, employs 5 people. Or Bill Save UK employs 300 people in this constituency. The Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Surgeons. You know, the list goes on of people. I've always thought, actually, in the end, the public will get sick of hearing the politicians having a go at each other. But there are plenty of other people who believe that it's right for us to remain. And let me say why, as a proud member of the Labour Party, why why I really believe that this argument that somehow by withdrawing from Europe will give us more power and control. Look, I have always believed that we succeed when we work with others. And in a world that is more connected than ever before, real control, the ability to shape your destiny, to tackle challenges, seize opportunities, and not be left to the mercy of events, can only come through working with others. And I do believe President Obama was right when he says nations that wield influence most effectively do it through the collective action that today's challenges require. Now, I'm sorry, I've got to finish this point. I agree with Steve that one of the big problem we face as a country, and indeed as a world, is that the way the economy is working is not benefiting most ordinary working people. Ed Miliband said this, before the crash, most people weren't seeing the benefits of growth. I want to see a change in how the economy works, but pulling up the drawbridge and thinking we can go it alone rather than working with other countries is not going to solve that problem. And sir, you feel that you were lied to. I have never, but now, in the air, I have never lied about what my views are, about why I think it benefits us, but in the end, the people will decide. You'll vote yes or no, and it will be down to you.
Yeah, just very quickly, can I challenge something that Nicky said earlier? She said we want to be an outward-looking country. Yes, we do. We agree. We want to be an outward-looking country. We don't think we can be an outward-looking country inside an inward-looking, self-referential, protectionist EU. And then Liz here is saying we want to work with others. Of course we want to work with others. We are one of the most globally interconnected countries in the world. We're permanent members of the UN Security Council, NATO, the Commonwealth, the OECD, the World Bank, so many international organisations. We're not objecting to that. We want to be good neighbours, not bad tenants. We want to work and cooperate with other countries. What we don't want is to be governed by foreign institutions where we have very little influence and no control, where we can be told what to do and we cannot respond to it. Democracy is fundamentally about being able to elect the people who make our laws. We can't do that in Europe. That is the difference. No, we can't do.
Assuming the League win, who come out, Tusk as itself is a very small Socialist party. How would you need to go a broad coalition? Have you got any thoughts and ideas how you can bring that about?
Okay, wait. Let's take this down another line. You may be able to talk about that afterwards if you want to. Can I also just say to everybody here, please?
It's a post EU referendum situation. What's going to happen to this country?
If I mention that and then come in on some of the other things that are directly related.
Okay, fine. Can I also just say, please, this is a debate. It should not descend into personal insults.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the fears that some people have about leaving the EU is they think that it will leave Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage in charge. You know, that's maybe not on the question sheet, but I think that's in a lot of people's minds. And I think one of the consequences of leaving the EU could well be David Cameron goes. And even people in his own party have said that. And given that the government is in a weak position with a small majority, has had to do U-turns on a whole number of issues, and it's relevant because they've U-turned, okay, delayed, or, you know, amended, not completely got rid of some of the things they've said, like disability cuts, working tax credit cuts. And that's because they're in a weak position that they've done that. Now, I think it's not guaranteed that you'd have, I don't think UKIP or Nigel Farage will benefit from an exit. I don't think necessarily even Boris Johnson will. What you could have is a completely new situation in Britain where the Tory party even splits. The possibility of a general election where a change can take place. Now it's relevant because how can we get, you know, this voice saying there's something different we want? How do we get it? Well, we have to build it from below. People like you and me need to get together and discuss it. But I don't think you can reform the EU. That's the point. You say that you have to be inside it to change it. There's organisations I don't think we can do that. NATO, you know, can we do that? Can we? Some of these institutions are organised for one purpose alone, and that is to oppress us, in my view. You have to build new institutions from the beginning. I've got plenty of links with people within Europe By the way, another small point, just come back from an earlier point, let's not get confused about the European Court of Human Rights. You can leave the EU and still be in that. They're separate institutions.
Not the other way around.
That's good.
Yes, but you can still leave the EU and still be part of the European Court of Human Rights. And also, by the way, being in the European Union has not stopped this government announcing in their Queen's speech that it wants to scrap the Human Rights Act here.
Yeah.
So there's no guarantees. It's true, in or out, there's no guarantees. We have to be vigilant on all these points and oppose all of these attacks. Councillors against the cuts last year moved an amendment to the council budget saying, don't put that money into reserves, use it to keep services running, and earmark some of it to help the voluntary sector. That was a motion put to Leicester City Council, which every Labour councillor voted against. So the point is, if the will is there to oppose cuts and to restore funding to projects, it can be done. The problem is, the European Union also has written into its treaties austerity, cuts in public services, privatisation. If you had, for example, perhaps a Labour government elected with Jeremy Corbyn at its head, saying, I'm against austerity, I want to renationalise public services and public utilities and so on, he will come up against the European Union. Now, I think he could do it anyway, but he would do it against the European Union. It would be a conflict like there was in Greece, if you remember. When the Greek government said it was against austerity, they were posed with this choice, either do what the EU says or leave. Unfortunately, they decided to do what the EU says. I hope that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't do that. But that will be the stark choice that we'll be facing an anti-austerity government in the future. And it's cuts, above all, that really hits the most vulnerable. They're the people under this government and the previous governments who've been hit by austerity and would be hit by the EU rules. £120 billion a year is uncollected in tax in this country from the super rich, from big business and rich individuals. A government can collect that money and use it to fund services. That's the point. That would be a political choice. By the way, you can say what you want to the member of European Parliament, but they've got no power. You can't vote out the European government. They have no real power. The power's in the hands of appointed officials in the European Commission and the heads of state, in reality, who do horse tradings. And every single one of those governments in Europe, by the way, is a pro-austerity, pro-capitalist government. We need to get rid of that, and that means a political fight. It means not relying on the EU. By the way, the procurement rules and the competitive tendering, those rules that come from the European Union, they're also pushing privatisation. That's the reality. You know, there's so many things you could say, and I know I haven't got time.
Yeah,
but it's a much more complex issue. We've got to rely on ourselves to fight.